Hello and welcome to the Deduction, a Tax Foundation podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Hulehan, and today we are joined by Alex Muresianu, Senior Policy Analyst here at the Tax Foundation. And unsurprisingly, once again, we're going to hit on a one big, beautiful bill topic here. When you hear that Americans spend 7.1 billion, with a B, hours on taxes every year, does that sound like a system that's working for the American people?
It certainly doesn't sound like it. Now, of course, when you have taxes to collect, it's going to take some time for people to figure out what they owe and actually, send that money off. But there is an enormous amount of room for improvement, and it shouldn't take, the equivalent of, the entire city of Los Angeles working around the clock to handle taxes every year.
Alex wrote this really great paper on complexity in the income tax system post One Big Beautiful Bill. So I'm kind of wondering, Alex, if the TCJA really, simplified taxes for millions, why was there such an urgency to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill Act?
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which passed in 2017, included a lot of different tax changes on the individual income tax side. Not only did it cut rates, but it eliminated or limited a lot of different deductions and, limited the alternative minimum tax, created some new deductions like 99A. But point being, it made a lot of these changes on the individual income tax side, structural changes in many respects. And all of those individual changes were scheduled to expire at the end of 2025. And the code would effectively revert to its pre-2017, pre-TCJA form. And so that was the impetus for doing something in tax this year. And, for the most part, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3, I like OB3 as a name. OB3, made most of the changes from Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, but it also added a lot of new changes as well, and didn't fully preserve some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act changes too.
First off, this is just a little inside baseball here. Part of working at the Tax Foundation is you got to know all of these acronyms and jargon. That was the hardest part of coming here. OB3, DB, SBC, there's so many acronyms, it's hard to get it all down. So if you're having a hard time following it, we're going to try to explain it all for you. But I think that's a tricky part of all of this. So Alex, I'm kind of wondering, with the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3, what are some of the policy wins in that?
Yeah, so I think, and the paper is mostly focused on the individual income tax side, and that's how I'll focus mostly. I'll just say up front, I think the biggest policy win from a growth perspective is establishing full expensing for investment in equipment and domestic research and development. That substantially changes, the cost structure for companies looking to invest in the United States. Effectively eliminates a tax penalty for investment, and that, is probably the most powerful pro-growth policy in the bill. But I just wanted to say that at the beginning, and then basically for the rest of the podcast, I'll focus on the individual income tax. And so I think on the individual income tax, the big win is not only extending a lot of the TCJA simplifications and individual rate cuts, but perhaps more importantly, making them permanent. The whole reason we were in this position of having to do a tax bill this year was because that these changes that people have been living with for 8 years, were scheduled to expire. And so that created the urgency to do something. But ideally, you want to have stability in the tax code. I think that is sort of part of, we have simplicity and stability as two sort of different principles of sound tax policy, but they kind of interact with each other. If the tax code keeps changing, that makes filing tax more complicated, because you've got to think about, what are the rules now? And so making a lot of changes permanent, the reduced rates and limits to itemized deductions, mostly retained higher, thresholds for the alternative minimum tax, which effectively makes you recalculate your income tax liability with a whole second sort of set of rules. That, is a win for simplification. But not only are there a bunch of new provisions that are sort of separate from the TCJA extension and permanence, but also a couple of the gains made in TCJA are dulled down or partially retracted.
Yeah, and I think, some of what, we see that doesn't work, and let's call it complexity creep in the tax code, is all of these, a lot of Trump's promises were like no tax on XYZ thing. And some of that made it into the bill, no tax on tips or no tax on, and it doesn't exactly work that way. But why do you feel like lawmakers made the decision to keep layering on narrow deductions instead of trying to find broader simplification?
I guess the sort of classic economist line here would be about, concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, where it's easier to sell, politicians want to sell like a narrow tax cut that has like larger benefits for a very small subset of the population, rather than like broad tax cuts that are a little bit more sort of incremental in their nature. And, I think that fortunately in recent years, at least before OB3, politicians had there was a successful sort of concerted movement to get away from that sort of tax policy, I think stretching back almost back to the 1980s, where we have incremental reforms that lowered tax rates on the individual income tax side and brought in basis and got rid of these sort of targeted deductions or special treatment of different types of income, and instead, taxed them all at lower rates. This is how we've gone from having, individual marginal tax rates in excess of 50 or 70 or even 90% going far enough back to a top rate now permanently of 37%, that we're still raising a roughly similar amount of income, and that's due to the base broadening that we've done since then. And that's what Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did. I mean, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was a net tax cut, but, they reduced personal income tax rates and shifted brackets around, but they limited deductions like the mortgage interest deduction and the state and local income tax deduction. And that was, the same sort of pattern of reform we've seen several times since the 80s and even earlier. But the introduction of new deductions like the tipped income deduction or the overtime income deduction should get in the habit of saying that instead of no tax on, because both of those deductions have various limits associated with them. And, payroll tax is still in play as well. But, those sort of narrow benefits or benefits for subcategories of income, that's something we have generally been able to move away from, and OB3 is sort of taking us in the wrong direction.
Am I correct that more people are going to be itemizing and there's a cost to that?
Yeah, so there are two, paths you can take while filing individual income tax. You can choose to take the standard deduction, which is just a general deduction available to everyone, or you could choose to itemize. So instead of taking the standard deduction, you will be able to access a bunch of specific deductions for different types of expenses or costs or what have you. And the process of itemizing, generally is much more time intensive. And, you have to have a lot of expenses in those eligible sort of specific categories to bother choosing to itemize rather than take the standard deduction. And, having a lot of these different deductions, these itemized deductions, can create, economic distortions favoring certain types of expenses over others. And so what Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did was it raised the standard deduction and limited a bunch of the major itemized deductions. Most significantly, it capped the amount of state and local tax that is deductible at $10,000. And it also reduced tightened limitations on the mortgage interest deduction. And those changes in concert, not both making the standard deduction more generous and limiting the itemized deductions, it also eliminated some smaller miscellaneous itemized deductions. I significantly reduced the number of people using itemized deductions, from about 30% of taxpayers to, around 10%. If you just evaluate the opportunity cost of taking itemized deductions instead of the standard deduction, that translates to actually like billions of dollars worth of savings every year due to the reduced complexity from choosing to take the standard deduction. Now, OB3 does, all those limits along with the individual income tax rate cuts were expiring at the end of this year. OB3 mostly retains them. It keeps the higher standard deduction, which was going to expire, actually pluses it up a little bit. And it also keeps most, but not all of the limitations to itemized deductions. The big exception is that it raises the cap for the state and local tax deduction to $40,000 instead of $10,000. And so this means that, about our projections are around 14% of taxpayers itemize in say 2026, as opposed to 10%, which is what would have happened had they just made all the TCJA changes permanent. And that increase, 10% to 14%, it doesn't sound that big, but when you take into account the opportunity cost there and the number of taxpayers, that's almost 7 million taxpayers who are now itemizing who wouldn't have had TCJA been made permanent cleanly. That translates to about $1.7 billion a year in additional compliance costs, which necessarily look huge in the context of the overall system, but like it is an active choice to move in the wrong direction.
No doubt. I mean, $1.7 billion, when you think about that, I mean, it's a massive number. I think some of these changes, they might not sound like a big deal, but when you put it in the context of those numbers, it's pretty staggering. So there is something else that's coming up. There's expirations. We're talking about, we like stability, we like permanent policy here at Tax Foundation largely, but there are some provisions that are set to expire in OB3. Could you run us through those?
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure this is going to be a comprehensive list. I'm sure I will forget some of them. That is, I think I've made this joke before here and in other places, but whether it's a beautiful bill or a beautiful law, that may be up to interpretation, but no one can deny that it's big. And there are a lot of different provisions in it. I'm undoubtedly going to miss some. So the big expirations come at the end of 2028. The big ones then are the Trump campaign promise type proposals, the deduction for tipped income, the deduction for some overtime income, the car loan interest deduction, or certain types of car loan interest for certain cars based on domestic production. To come at the end of 2028. The other sort of significant individual income tax one to think about is the higher SALT cap, the $40,000 SALT cap will revert back to $10,000 after 2029. It's actually scheduled to increase sort of very incrementally each year after 2025 from 40,000, but it will revert to 10,000 after 2029. So 2028 into 2029, there's going to be another sort of debate, I think, what is going to happen to these new provisions, and also, if they're going to be extended, are we like A, are you going to extend them? B, what else are you going to do in whatever legislative package that ends up dealing with them? I would say, unlike the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expirations, where we've made some structural changes, but extending them comes with costs. How do we trade off? How do we manage those trade-offs? I think at some level with these expiring provisions, I think the best option might be to just allow them to expire, do nothing, and just let them go away. But if that's an opportunity to do like better structural reforms as well as letting them expire, that would be an option too. But unlike, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which made some real positive like structural changes, were temporary, I don't think many of the provisions in OBBBA that are temporary are structural improvements. So I think that's actually less of an imperative to have to manage extending them.
So in a lot of ways, we're really setting ourselves up for kind of the same political circus again that we saw with TCJA. Is that right? I think there are. I think this is more like the OBBBA. I think it's more likely to look like OBBBA rather than TCJA in a couple years, because
TCJA was the product of a set of lawmakers who were interested in tax reform, quad tax reform. Like they really wanted to change the structure of the tax system, bring income tax rates down and broaden the base. On the whole, it was a net tax cut, but that was the big picture. People say, was it a $1.5 trillion tax cut? Like, no, it was a $6 trillion tax cut and a $4.5 trillion tax increase at the same time. You're shifting the composition of revenue. That was like an active goal to reform the tax code for the better. Now with OB3, it was more like, well, we've got to do something, which because these structural components that have been around for 8 years that people have really lived with, like, and gotten used to, are scheduled to go away. You've got to do something about that. Unfortunately, I think they chose a very good thing to do about that, which is make at least most of them permanent. But, it wasn't driven by like we need to positively change the structure of the tax code. It was, we need to make sure that this is dealt with. And then this is another legislative package to do a whole bunch of other stuff with. And, I'd expect if the legislative environment is more focused on these new provisions, that the conversation will be mostly about doing, more little things that people have suckered onto rather than a big structural reform. But hey, it's possible that we get a big structural reform in a couple of years. And especially when people think about deficits, we've got to think about, again, ways to broaden the base. And maybe that comes to head in 3 years. We'll see.
Yeah, I feel like there's just a missed opportunity somewhere in this that there could have been huge structural reforms. But I think when we're looking at this, the bigger picture of all of this is the complexity and the cost of the complexity that's been added. The U.S. tax code is now 4.3 million words. It's 40% longer than it was 3 decades ago. And that's not really a good thing. It's lost time, lost money, probably lost in trust in the system. How do you quantify this? Like, I know that we were talking about the itemized deduction stuff earlier, but there seems to be a real problem here with complexity, as you point out in your paper.
In the paper, we talk about a couple of angles that you could think about for how the bill or the law, does it increase or decrease tax complexity, and how do you measure that? How do you quantify that? Usually when we talked about measuring tax complexity, it's about, hours plus out-of-pocket expenses. How much time are you spending on tax compliance? And then also, like, are you paying for TurboTax? Are you hiring an accountant or something? So, that's one way to measure it. And we have there are a bunch of different estimates that you can use to, like, a quantification, a total quantification of the cost of tax compliance from that. So we have like regulatory compliance cost estimates that get published and then updated either every year or every couple of years, depending on the provision. And so we can take those hourly estimates and then apply like a opportunity cost of like the median wage to turn the hourly estimates into dollar estimates, and add up the out-of-pocket expenses with the opportunity cost and get to a number. That's where the $536 billion number came out in the most recent edition of our annual cost of compliance, paper. The issue, I think, with doing a overall estimate of OB3's like impact on tax compliance costs and tax complexity with that methodology is that a lot of these provisions are totally novel. And so we don't have, like old estimates of how long it takes to comply with the tipped income deduction. How many hours are people going to spend complying with that? Not only individuals, but, payroll departments, tax departments and companies. How long are they going to spend dealing with that? We don't know. Like we don't have like historic estimates to pull from. It's a novel policy. Same with the car loan interest deduction, over time, so we can surmise that the sign of the impact, that this is going to clearly increase tax complexity. You're adding a new deduction. You're not pulling stuff away. How big is that change? It's tough to say, but it more than likely outweighs the sort of very small efforts at like additional base broadening that was in the bill, that they pulled back a couple of the green energy credits on the individual income tax side. There's also a whole corporate side, but we're mostly focusing on the individual income tax, the credits for like, rooftop solar panels and other like personal energy, property and efficiency, and then the electric vehicle credits. There's a little bit of base broadening there, and that would reduce, compliance costs too, because, people aren't getting the credit, so they're not laying out any forms related to them. But, that's probably going to be a lot smaller of an effect than all these new deductions. So what we did, we can estimate some of the like changes for how much, the changes to itemizing, how much is that going to change compliance costs there, or the alternative minimum tax? They mostly keep this simplifications and reduced eligibility for AMT. How many fewer people are going to be, filing AMT? You can do those like individual estimates, which we did, but the big picture, there's a lot of new provisions, and it's we'll have to see how time intensive those ones are. The other approach to consider is just dollars. How much have you broadened the base as measured by like deductions that you've gotten rid of, and like what is the revenue associated with that versus like deductions that you've added, and what is like the revenue costs associated with that, which is a very imperfect way to think about complexity. Because, if you get rid of introduce like 10 provisions that each cost, $1 billion, that's like a lot more, feels like a lot more complexity probably than one provision that costs $10 billion. But, if you look at all the new stuff that was added, the new stuff is like a lot more expensive than the stuff that was, removed. And a lot of the stuff that was added was temporary and only lasts for 4 years. And it's still more expensive than the, old deductions that were limited. So if those were extended, it would be much more expensive. So that's like an imperfect way to think about how the code is maybe more complex than it was at least last year, but we really need to see like how big of a change this is.
Yeah, and in terms of it being novel, this is a totally anecdotal story, but we have a coworker, honestly, who, and this is a little bit tangential, but he recently had a kid and he qualifies for the Trump accounts, and it's like they don't actually want to do the admin to kind of like do all of that work. So is everybody? You don't know how many people who maybe qualify for the tax on tips are going to exactly do it. So I completely understand that we're just in a new space, so it's hard to estimate exactly how it's, because it could cost way more. I know that the energy credits and a lot of stuff costed a lot more than we expected. So there's variability in all of that. It's not a perfect system. To wrap this up here, as we're looking ahead to 2028, and we've probably covered this, but what's the number one reform you think that should be prioritized before we miss or another opportunity?
Yeah, so I think unlike the case of the TCJA expirations, where you've got to do something to like prevent the tax code from changing, like I think for 2028, if policymakers just let a lot of these new provisions die and didn't do anything else, that like might be better than what we're actually going to get. But, if say policymakers are thinking about, deficits are too high, we made some good changes in OB3, but it's too, deficits are too high, we've got to do something to like broaden income tax, or they're thinking about ways to raise revenue. I would say the best way to raise revenue is within relatively narrow political constraints. If you're not doing a broad like consumption tax, you should think about broadening the individual income tax base. I think the biggest like place to do that would be limiting the exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance in some way. That's something we've talked about a lot, but it is, we talk about no tax on tips or no tax on overtime, about how like income in certain industries is favored, but also, health insurance, employer-sponsored health insurance has like a very strong tax advantage relative to other forms of compensation. And so limiting that exclusion in any way even could be a policy that is, a upwards of $1 trillion over 10 years, like revenue option, depending on how, bold we're getting about like what kind of policy change could we see. I think that is like a middle ground between like very bold ask and like small, bold, very, very constrained political answer.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us on this show today. I appreciate you walking us through the complexity of this, which is quite a bit. And so thank you all for listening. You know where you can find us. You can email us at podcast@taxfoundation.org, or you can find us on Twitter @deductionpod. Thank you so much for listening.